Genevieve Stensgard, at 71, after 40 years teaching English literature at Lehigh Carbon Community College and 46 years as Magnus Stensgard's wife, had believed that the people who shared a kitchen for half a century would also share the truth of what they owned. She was wrong. Magnus had died 11 months ago on a Tuesday morning of a cardiac complication no one had thought serious. By the time the funeral lilies had wilted, his older sister Astrid had finished what the heart procedure started. She had taken every paper that mattered and replaced them with paperwork of her own. What Magnus had left Jen by name in his handwritten will was a single brass-bound iron key on a leather thong, knotted to a small handwritten tag in his careful teacher's hand. For Jen, the brewery on Hazard Road. The condemned papers are wrong, M. Jen had never even known the brewery existed. But what Astrid Stensgard Voll had never understood about her quiet younger brother was that Magnus had spent 20 years restoring the brewing equipment of their great-grandfather's closed Jim Thorpe brewery in secret every Saturday, building back a recipe book and a copper kettle that the family had been told was sold to satisfy debts in 1972. Astrid had been the one telling them that. Astrid had been the one filing the paperwork, and Magnus had been the one quietly preparing for the day his sister would come for his widow. If you've ever been told a piece of your family's history was lost decades before you were born, if you've ever stood with a single brass-bound key in your palm and wondered whether your husband's last gift was a kindness or a cruelty, if you've discovered that the people who loved you had been protecting you from the people who pretended to, this story is for you. Subscribe now, because what Genevieve Stensgard found behind the boarded oak door of her late husband's secret brewery will make you believe that a quiet teacher restores a copper kettle for 20 patient years only when he knows exactly who is meant to turn it on. Welcome to the last chapter. The 11 months since Magnus's funeral had moved through Jen's house like fog through the Lehigh Gorge, slow, low, settling into every cabinet and every drawer, until even the kitchen radio sounded muffled. She had kept teaching through October of the year he died, because her dean had asked her gently, and because the rhythm of a Tuesday-Thursday seminar on the American Transcendentalists had been the only thing that still felt shaped like Magnus. He had loved Emerson. He had quoted self-reliance at her over breakfast for 46 years. After the spring semester she had retired, and the silence had grown teeth. Astrid had appeared at the front door the morning after the funeral. Jen remembered the sharp bob of steel-gray hair, the silver-gray wool coat buttoned to the throat, the manila folder tucked under one arm like a clipboard at a hospital bedside. Astrid had been a hospital administrator at St. Luke's Allentown for 35 years. She carried paperwork the way other people carried umbrellas. "Genevieve, dear," she had said, stepping past Jen without being invited, "we should sit down and look at a few things while it's all still fresh." What Astrid had called a few things turned out to be the quiet, methodical disassembly of 46 years of marriage. Magnus's small joint checking account at the Carbon County Credit Union was redirected on Astrid's signature as named secondary executor to a probate sub-account Jen could not access. His teacher's pension survivorship paperwork sat for 6 weeks in Astrid's briefcase before she remembered to mail it. The small inheritance Magnus had received from his and Astrid's mother in 2009, $28,000 in a savings bond Jen had never thought about, was claimed by Astrid as a shared sibling asset. Through some clause, Jen did not have the energy to fight in February. By April, Astrid had stopped pretending the visits were grief calls. She arrived with new folders. She left with old ones. By June, she was bringing what she called the release of all residual claims. It was a single page of dense type with a yellow flag at the bottom and a post-it that said, in Astrid's tidy script, sign and date, finalizes the estate. Jen had set it on the kitchen table next to a teacup and not looked at it for 3 weeks. In the 11th month, on a Thursday morning in late October, Astrid came again. The maples on the front walk had gone copper. Astrid stood on the porch in her ivory wide-leg trousers and her black flat ankle boots and held the folder out the way a nurse holds a tray. Genevieve, we have to close this out. Redar and I are putting some plans in motion, and I need this finalized before the end of the month. Jen stood in the doorway in her forest green cashmere sweater with the bone toggle buttons, the half-moon reading glasses on their beaded chain at her chest, and listened to her sister-in-law explain again that everything would be simpler once Jen signed. Jen did not invite her in. Jen had been a teacher for 40 years. She knew when a student was lying about a missing essay, and she knew when a woman in a silver gray wool coat was lying about a savings bond. Astrid, she said, in the voice she had used on the boy who plagiarized Frost in 1994, I'm not going to sign that today. Astrid's thin lips tightened. Genevieve, you are being sentimental. Magnus would not want this dragging on. Magnus, Jen said, is not the one dragging it on. The silence on the porch was the kind that small mountain towns specialize in. Wind in the birches, a distant freight train down in the gorge, a wood thrush somewhere in the back garden. Astrid finally folded the folder back under her arm with the careful click of a woman accustomed to closing meetings. I will be back next week, she said, with my attorney. Jen watched the silver Mercedes pull away from the curb. Then she went inside, climbed the narrow stairs to the bedroom she had shared with Magnus, and opened the bottom drawer of her dresser. Under 3 folded scarves she had not worn since the funeral, she found the manila envelope she had put away the week Magnus died and had not opened since. On the front, in Magnus's careful teacher's hand, the words, for General, when the time comes. She sat on the edge of the bed. She unfolded the single sheet of yellow legal paper. It was Magnus's handwritten will, signed and witnessed by 2 people from his department, whose names she remembered from Christmas parties. It was short. It left her everything, and clipped to the back of it, in a small brown envelope, was something heavier than paper. She tipped the envelope into her palm. A brass-bound iron key on a leather thong slid out, cool and weighty, with a small handwritten tag knotted to it. For Jen, the brewery on Hazard Road. The condemned papers are wrong. Monsieur Jen sat very still. Outside the bedroom window, the late October light moved across the maples, and somewhere down in the kitchen, the old refrigerator hummed, the way it had hummed through every Saturday morning of her marriage, while Magnus, she now understood, had been driven to a place she did not know existed. Ludi Halverson arrived in her green Subaru Forester within the hour. Jen had called her the way Jen had called her about everything important since 1987, abruptly, without preamble, with a single sentence that meant come over now. Ludi had been Jen's longest English department colleague, a 69-year-old former medievalist who wore her hair in a thick gray braid down her back and kept a thermos of black tea in the cup holder of her Subaru at all times. She came up the porch steps in her hiking boots, took one look at Jen's face, and said, "All right, show me." Jen put the key on the kitchen table next to the will. Ludi read the tag. Ludi read it again. Then Ludi laughed once, sharp and helpless, and her eyes filled. "Genevieve, Hazard Road. Have you ever been out there?" "I've driven past the trailhead 100 times. Past the brewery?" "What brewery?" Ludi went out to the Subaru and came back with her laptop. They sat at the kitchen table while Ludi pulled up the Carbon County tax assessor's online records. The parcel on Hazard Road was listed under the name Stensgard Holdings, registered 1879, current status condemned, structurally unsafe, scheduled for demolition. A demolition deposit had been filed in February. The wrecking crew was scheduled for the second week of November. Ludi counted on her fingers. "Jennifer, that's 22 days from today." Jen's hand closed around the brass-bound key on the table. "Who paid the deposit?" she said, though she already knew. Ludi scrolled. "Astrid Stensgard Vole, filed February 9th, while she was sitting in my kitchen telling me about a savings bond." Yes. They drove down to the small coffee shop on Broadway and Jim Thorpe an hour later, because Jen needed to think with the smell of coffee in her nose, and because Ludi had not eaten lunch. They were sitting at the window table with 2 cups of black coffee and a slice of pumpkin bread between them when Jen looked across the room and felt the bottom of her stomach drop. Astrid was at the corner booth in her silver gray wool coat, head bent in conference with a thick-shouldered man in a Carhartt jacket. On the table between them was a clipboard and a folded blueprint. Jen could read the heading on the blueprint from 20 feet away. Hazard Road Demolition. Site Plan. The man in the Carhartt jacket laughed at something Astrid said. Astrid did not laugh. Astrid never laughed. But her thin lips moved into the small, careful curve that, for 46 years, Jen had watched her use on the people she had already decided to defeat. Astrid looked up. Her cold blue eyes found Jen across the room. The curve did not change. The recognition did not enter her face. She simply looked away again, slowly, as if Jen were a coat rack. Ludi reached across the table and put her warm, calloused hand over Jen's. "Drink your coffee, Genevieve. We are going home and we are reading every word of that will." That night, alone in the bedroom, Jen took the manila envelope out again and emptied it onto the quilt. The will, the key. And folded behind the will, something she had not noticed in the morning's hurry, a square of soft, worn leather creased into thirds. She lifted it. It unfolded into Magnus's old brewing apron, the one he had told her years ago was a teaching apron from a high school chemistry demonstration. It was canvas-backed, leather-fronted, stained at the hem with what she had taken for 40 years to be old chalk. She lifted it to her face. It smelled of cedar and hops and a faint dry sweetness she had no name for. She sat down on the edge of the bed with the apron in her lap and wept, finally, in the quiet way of women who have been holding something for 11 months. Magnus had taught American history at the regional high school for 38 years. He had coached the Quiz Bowl team. He had run the Civil War unit every February with a passion that bordered on tender. His great-grandfather, Olaf Stensgard, had come to Carbon County from Bergen in 1877, had worked 2 years in the anthracite, and in 1879 had founded a small brewery on a piece of land at the edge of Jim Thorpe, where a clear spring came down out of the gorge. The Stensgard Brewery had run for 93 years. In 1972, The family had been told it was sold to satisfy debts. The story in the family had been that Astrid, then 22 and freshly graduated, had handled the paperwork for their grieving father, that the building had been boarded, that the equipment had been auctioned, that the recipes had been lost. Magnus had been 13. Magnus had not asked questions. Magnus, Jen now understood, had spent the next 60 years asking nothing but the right one, in private, on Saturdays. In the morning, Jen put the brass-bound key in the inside pocket of her long, charcoal gray wool coat. She put the worn, medium brown leather suitcase with the brass clasps into the back of Ludi's Subaru, because she had decided, without quite admitting it to herself, that she was not going to be coming home that night. They drove out Hazard Road in the cool November mountain mist, with the autumn gold birches arching over the gravel and the Lehigh Gorge dropping away to their right. The brewery rose out of the mist at the bend of the road like a thing that had been waiting. 3 stories of dark brick, a Romanesque arched central entrance, tall arched windows boarded with weathered planks, a tall brick smokestack with an iron crown, ivy climbing the north wall, a sagging tin loading dock canopy on the east side. The cobblestone yard was scattered with fallen birch leaves, and above the great oak door, in faded copper gilded ironwork that even in its rust and patina was perfectly legible, the single word, Stensgard. Jen stopped in the middle of the yard and put one hand to her mouth. She had walked past the trailhead at the end of Hazard Road for 20 years. She had hiked the Lehigh Gorge with Magnus on Saturdays in summer. She had never once turned her head to the brick building set back among the birches. She had not known her own name was on a wall. Ludi said softly, "Sweet woman, look at it." Jen walked up to the heavy oak door. The iron strap hinges were green with age but solid. The brass-bound iron lock was clean, not corroded, not painted shut. Someone had been oiling it. She drew the key out of the inner pocket of her coat. Her hand was steady. The key entered the lock easily. The first turn met resistance. The second turn caught, and the great lock rolled over with a slow, heavy click that she felt in her sternum. The door swung inward. The hall behind it smelled of cold copper and old oak and the faint dryness of grain. A long, wide nave ran the length of the building, lit dimly by the mist-pale light filtering through cracks in the boarded windows. And in the center of the hall, on a raised brick platform, stood a polished copper kettle the height of a man, gleaming like a slow sunrise. Even in that gray light, it was clean, it was complete, its rivets shone, its iron fittings had been re-blackened. A man had been polishing it. On a wooden side table beside the kettle lay a leather-bound brewer's notebook, open to a page dated 3 weeks before Magnus died. Jen walked to the table and bent her head over the page. Magnus's careful teacher's handwriting, in fountain pen ink, neat as a syllabus. The last line read, "Phase 4, restoration complete. Recipe finalized. Ready for Jen when she finds the staircase to the cellar." Monsieur Ludi made a small sound behind her. Jen did not turn around. She put her palm flat on the brick platform beside the copper kettle, and for a long moment she could not tell whether she was steadying herself against a building or steadying a building against herself. She did not weep again. She had wept the night before with the apron in her lap. What rose in her now was something quieter and more useful, the disciplined attention of 40 years of close reading. She straightened her half-moon glasses on their beaded chain, settled them on her nose, and turned to Ludi. "Ludi," she said, "we are going to need index cards." Ludi laughed for the second time that week. "I have a stack in the Subaru." The next 4 hours were, Jen would say later, the hours in which she remembered who she was. She set up a small workstation at the edge of the main hall, pulling forward a clean oak side table that Magnus had clearly been using as a desk. From Ludi's car came a stack of 3x5 index cards, 2 felt-tip pens, a small camera, and a pad of yellow legal paper. From Jen's leather suitcase came the half-moon reading glasses, a fresh notebook, and the patience of a woman who had taught freshmen to annotate Hawthorne. She started with the kettle. She wrote on the first index card, in her clean, small hand, Object 1, copper brew kettle, approximately 7 feet tall, riveted construction, restored finish, iron fittings re-blackened. Provenance, presumed Stensgard Brewing original equipment, circa 1879 to 1908. Condition, operational. She photographed it from 4 sides. She turned the card over. She wrote on the back, note, kettle has been recently polished. Estimated last polishing, within 30 days. Card 2, the wooden side table and the leather-bound brewer's notebook. She did not pick up the notebook. She photographed the page it lay open to, the surrounding tools, a measuring jug, a brass thermometer, a small boxwood ruler, and the dust patterns on the table around them. She made a note. Notebook is open to page dated October 1st of this year. Surrounding objects show no dust accumulation. The notebook has been in active use. Card 3, the floor. She paced the hall in slow grids the way she had once paced the back of a classroom while students sat the SATs. She cataloged a row of empty oak crates along the south wall, a workbench under the boarded east window with hand tools laid out in clean order, a coiled length of copper tubing suspended from a wall hook, a small cast-iron stove in the corner with a kettle on it for tea, dry but not rusted. Every item went onto an index card. Every card got a photograph. By card 17, Ludi had stopped trying to help and had started simply watching her oldest friend do what her oldest friend did. Genevieve, Ludi said at last, gently, you understand that you are processing this brewery the way you used to process a manuscript. I am aware, said Jen, without looking up. It is the most magnificent thing I have ever seen. Jen permitted herself a small smile. She made card 18. By the time the morning mist had lifted off the gorge and a thin November sun had come through the gaps in the boarding, Jen had cataloged 41 objects in the main hall and a working theory in her notebook. The theory was simple. Magnus had not been hiding the brewery from her. Magnus had been protecting the brewery for her against the day his sister moved on it. Every piece of evidence in the hall said the same thing. The building was sound, the equipment was operational, the work was finished, and the only thing missing was the woman who would be told the truth. She closed her notebook. She picked up the brewer's notebook from the side table at last, with the care of an archivist handling a folio, and turned it backwards from the open page. The entries marched back 20 years in Magnus's neat script, month by month, Saturday by Saturday. The slow, careful restoration of a kettle, the rebuilding of fermenting vessels, the trial batches, the failures, the cedar and hops apron stained at the hem. On the inside front cover, in the same hand, a dedication, for Genevieve, who has been teaching me close reading since 1979. Ludi was watching her. Ludi said quietly, "We have to call somebody, Jen." "Yes," said Jen. "Call Boris." Boris Mendoza had retired from the Pennsylvania Liquor Control Board in 2014 after 38 years as a field inspector. Ludi had taught his daughter freshman composition in 2002, which was how their families had become Christmas card families. Boris was 67, broad-shouldered, with gray hair cropped close to the skull, and a habit of pinching the bridge of his nose before saying anything important. Ludi reached him on his cell phone at his kitchen table in Lehighton. She explained in 3 sentences. He said, "Hazard Road, Stensgard. I will be there in 40 minutes." He arrived in 43. He came up the cobblestone yard in a tan canvas work jacket with a battered leather inspector's case in his right hand. He stopped in the middle of the yard the way Jen had stopped and looked up at the copper-gilded letters above the door and then said, more to the building than to the women in front of it, "Well, there you are." Inside, he set the inspector's case on Magnus's oak-side table and walked the length of the hall in slow, even strides. He laid one weathered palm against the copper kettle. He bent and examined the rivets. He looked at the workbench and the coiled copper tubing. He picked up the brewer's notebook, read 3 pages, set it down, and removed his glasses. He pinched the bridge of his nose. "Mrs. Stensgard," he said, turning to Jen, "I inspected this building in February of 1972. I was 26 years old. I had been on the job 4 months. I told the family that day that there was nothing structurally or operationally wrong with this brewery. I told them the equipment was sound, the licenses were renewable, and there was no reason to close. The man I spoke to was your husband's father. The woman who answered the door and signed the inspection acknowledgement was your husband's older sister. She was 22. Jen sat down slowly on a crate. "Astrid never let your husband finish that sentence," Boris said. "I remember her. I remember the way she signed the form. I remember the way she walked me back to my car. I have been wondering for 54 years what happened to that kettle." "It was here," said General, "all along." "Yes, ma'am, it was." He stayed the rest of the afternoon. He photographed equipment with an old digital camera he carried in his case. He made notes about pre-Prohibition brewing licenses and the way they could, under certain Pennsylvania statutes, be reactivated by direct heritage descent. He told General, gently, that he believed she had a working brewery on her hands and that he believed she had a fight on her hands. He told Ludi he wanted to call a journalist he trusted in Philadelphia who covered craft brewing for the Brewer's Journal. Ludi said yes before Jen finished nodding. Naya Persad drove up from Philadelphia the next morning. She was 36, slight, with dark hair pulled back in a clip and a reporter's notebook already open in her left hand when she stepped out of her gray hatchback. She had been writing about regional craft brewing for 9 years. She knew Boris by reputation. She had, she said, never expected to be standing in front of an intact pre-Prohibition Stensgard. "You're aware," she said to Jen, "that this name appears in 3 different histories of Pennsylvania, brewing as a closed concern." "I am now," said General. Naya laughed. "Mrs. Stensgard, may I please come inside?" They were inside, with Boris leading Naya from the kettle to the workbench to the coiled copper tubing, when Jen, standing at the back of the hall, parted the heavy curtain that hung along the rear wall and saw the door. It was narrow. It was oak. It had iron strap hinges that matched the front door, and it had a brass-bound iron lock identical to the one in her hand. "Ludi," Jen said quietly. Ludi came over. Boris and Naya followed. Jen took the brass-bound key out of her coat pocket. She slid it into the lock. The first turn met resistance. The second turn rolled the lock over with the same heavy click she had felt in her sternum at the front door. The narrow oak door swung inward to reveal a stone staircase descending into darkness. "That," said Naya softly, "is going to be a cellar." Jen put one foot on the top step. The stone was dry. The air rising from below was cool and faintly sweet. She had taken one breath toward the second step when the unmistakable crunch of tires on cobblestone sounded from the yard outside, and Ludi, at the front of the hall, said in a flat voice, "Jenner the Mercedes." Jen took her foot off the step. "Lock the front door," said Boris very calmly. bolted from the inside. Ludi crossed the hall at a clip. The heavy oak door at the front of the brewery was equipped with an iron drop bar set into brackets in the wall. Ludi lifted it and dropped it into place. The bar rang once against the iron and was still. Outside, a car door opened and closed. Heels crossed the cobblestones. A fist hit the oak door. "Genevieve!" Astrid's voice came through the wood, thin and high and furious. "Genevieve, I know you're in there. Open this door." Jen sat down on the third stone step of the cellar staircase. She didn't stand. She did not call back. She put her palm flat on the stone beside her and felt the cool, dry weight of the building above her settle into her ribs. Boris came to the top step and handed her a flashlight from his inspector's case. Naya knelt on the second step and opened her notebook. "Genevieve," Astrid was hammering now, "this building is condemned. You are trespassing. The demolition crew is contracted for next week. I have called Rydar and I have called my attorney, and if you do not open this door, I will call the county sheriff." Boris met Jen's eyes. He shook his head once, slowly. Jen shook her head once back. The hammering continued for what felt like a long time, and was, Ludi said later, 6 minutes. Astrid moved from threats to insults to what Jen understood, listening from the third stone step, as the sound of a sister-in-law watching 54 years of inherited control come apart against an iron drop bar. Astrid called her sentimental. Astrid called her a fool. Astrid said the word widow as if it were an accusation. Astrid said, finally, "You have no idea what is in that building, Genevieve. You will sign the release. You will sign it tomorrow." Then the heels crossed the cobblestones again. The car door opened and closed. The Mercedes rolled out of the yard. The November mist closed behind it. The four of them in the brewery did not move for another full minute. Then Jen put one hand on the stone wall of the staircase, took the flashlight from Boris, and began to descend. The cellar was vaulted. Brick arched overhead, dry, cool, smelling of stone and hops and the faintest cedar. Jen's flashlight beam moved across the wall and found first 3 more polished copper fermenting vessels, arranged in a row along the south wall, their hoops gleaming. Beyond them, a wall of oak-aged barrels stacked 2 high, each stenciled in faded white paint with a year. The earliest she could read said 1908. The latest said, in fresh black ink, this year. Magnus had been laying down a barrel a year for 20 years. At the far end of the cellar, against the north wall, stood a mahogany desk. It was a piece of furniture Jen had never seen before and recognized immediately. The curve of its legs, the brass drawer pulls, the green leather inlay on its top. It was the twin of a desk that had stood in Magnus's father's parlor when Jen had visited as a young bride in 1979 and been told in passing that it had been lost in the clean-out. Lost. Jen ran her fingertips along its edge. The desktop was clean, laid out in careful order, a leather portfolio of recipes, a thick file of restoration notes, a smaller file labeled correspondence, a small framed sepia portrait of a man with a heavy mustache and Jen's own narrow nose, and a folded photograph that had clearly been kept in a wallet for decades. Jen unfolded it. It was a picture of herself, at 28, sitting on the rocks above the Lehigh Gorge in a cotton sundress, laughing at the photographer. She remembered the sundress. She did not remember the picture. She had not known Magnus had carried it with him for 43 years. Boris had come down the stairs behind her. He stopped at the bottom. "Mrs. Stensgard," he said, "open the top right drawer." She opened it. Inside lay a single document in a leather sleeve. She drew it out. The paper was heavy and yellowed and bore a county seal in red wax. She unfolded it on the desk and read the careful copperplate script of the year 1879. It was the original deed for the Stensgard brewing parcel. The description ran to 2 pages. It included the brewery building, it included the cobblestone yard, and it included, by metes and bounds described against the bank of the Lehigh, the adjacent 40 acres of gorge frontage running north along the river. General read the metes and bounds twice. Then she sat down in Magnus's chair. "Boris," she said, "the 40 acres." "Yes, ma'am." "Astrid has those listed under a separate LLC." "Yes, ma'am, I know. I looked yesterday after Ludi called. They are listed under a Vol Land Holdings LLC, registered 2018, in your sister-in-law's married name. The county has been treating them as severed since about 1984. "Are they severed?" "No, ma'am. Not according to that piece of paper on the desk in front of you." Naya was at the bottom of the stairs now, too, her notebook open. The county records would have a clerical error from the 80s, she said. Those happen, but a recorded original deed with an unbroken chain of title supersedes a clerical reclassification. You can file that deed at the courthouse on Monday, and the LLC's claim collapses by Wednesday. Jen put one hand flat on the deed. The 40 acres of Lehigh Gorge frontage had been, according to Magnus's brewer's notebook upstairs, the source of the spring water that had made the original 1908 lager what it was. Astrid had been quietly preparing to subdivide them into residential lots. Jen, who had walked that gorge with Magnus on Saturdays for 40 years, found that her hand on the deed was perfectly still. She closed the top drawer and bent to look beneath the desk. There, in a recess she had not seen from above, sat a small brass-bound mahogany document case with a clasp like a miniature of the lock on her key. She drew it out. She set it on the desk. She opened it. Inside, in tissue paper, lay a folio of heavy parchment documents. The first was a federal patent grant, dated 1908, signed by an officer of the United States Patent Office, granting Olaf Stensgard the exclusive right to 2 pre-Prohibition brewing recipes, a porter and a lager. The lager was named on the grant in Olaf's own hand, Lehigh Gorge Lager. The recipe followed in a separate folio, written out in measurements that married metric and customary in the style of a Norwegian brewer who had learned his trade in Bergen and his English in Carbon County. Naya, behind her, said something under her breath in a language Jen did not recognize. Then, in English, "Mrs. Stensgard, you have an intact pre-Prohibition federally patented recipe in original author hand, with the matching kettle, in operating condition, in its original building, on its original parcel. There are perhaps 4 of those left in the United States." 4, Jen repeated. "Possibly 3. The second document in the case was a single-page typed letter on watermarked stationery, dated 1971, from the Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission. It was addressed to Olaf Stensgard's grandson, Magnus and Astrid's father, and it expressed the Commission's interest in nominating the Stensgard Brewery for the National Register of Historic Places. It asked for a return letter at the family's earliest convenience. Clipped to the back was an envelope, open, postmarked Allentown, 1971, addressed to the family in the same Pennsylvania historical hand. The envelope was empty. The reply had never been sent. The interception was unmistakable. It had been intercepted by a 21-year-old daughter who already understood what her family did not. Boris, behind Jen, said in a low voice, "Mrs. Stensgard." "I know," said Jen. The fourth thing on the desk was an envelope, cream paper, sealed with a small drop of brown sealing wax, addressed in Magnus's careful teacher's hand, for Jen, open last. She set it aside while Boris went upstairs to make calls. He stood in the doorway of the front hall with one shoulder against the jamb and his cell phone to his ear, and over the next 2 hours he worked his way through a list he had been carrying in his head for 54 years. He called a colleague at the Pennsylvania Liquor Control Board. He called a regional preservation officer he had known in the 90s. He called, at Naya's prompting, a man named Halsey at Halsey Brothers Heritage Beverages out of Reading, who had built a small empire restoring closed 19th century breweries to working operation. By the time the November light was going gold against the boarded windows of the front hall, Boris came back down the cellar stairs with his cell phone in his hand and a careful expression on his face. "Mrs. Stensgard, Halsey Brothers wants to send a team Monday morning. They are prepared to offer $1.6 million to license the heritage rights and operate this brewery as a working living history operation under your continued family ownership. You retain the building, the deed, the recipes, the brand. They handle production, distribution, and capital improvements. The 40 acres are yours and stay yours." Jen sat in Magnus's chair with the brass-bound key on the desk beside the open mahogany case. "Will they donate the gorge frontage to a land trust?" she asked. Boris blinked. I imagine they would consider that a positive." "Then we will see them Monday." She picked up Magnus's last envelope. She slid her thumb under the seal. The brown wax broke cleanly. Inside was a single sheet of cream paper, folded in thirds. She unfolded it. She put on her half-moon reading glasses. She read it once silently. Then she read it aloud to Ludi and Boris and Naya, because Magnus had been a teacher of 40 years and had written it to be read aloud. "My slow, patient love," she read. "If you are reading this, my sister has finally moved on the brewery, and you have done what I always knew you would. The condemned papers were always wrong. The lie is older than I am. You will find the deed in the mahogany case under the desk. You will find the recipes there, too. You will find a portrait of my great-grandfather. He had your nose, and now you know where it came from. The brewery is yours. The gorge is yours. The truth is yours. Walk out into the November mist with your suitcase, my love, and tell the truth to anyone who asks. M." For a long moment no one spoke. Ludi sat down on a crate and wept, openly and without apology, the way old friends weep for each other's husbands. Boris removed his glasses and pinched the bridge of his nose, and did not put the glasses back on for a full minute. Naya closed her notebook against her chest and said, in a voice carefully drained of professional distance, "Mrs. Stensgard, I have not seen a pre-Prohibition copper kettle restored to operating condition in 18 years of writing about this industry. You will not be tearing down anything. We will be writing about this for years." Jen folded the letter. She folded it slowly, along the same creases Magnus had made. She put it back in its envelope. She put the envelope in the inside pocket of her long charcoal gray wool coat against her sternum, where the brass-bound key had ridden for 2 days. She stood up from Magnus's chair. "All right," she said, "let's go to work." They closed the brewery that evening in the long blue dusk that comes down off the Lehigh Gorge in November. Boris locked the cellar door with the brass-bound key and handed it back to Jen with the small ceremony of a man returning a sword. Ludi carried the index cards out to the Subaru in a shoebox borrowed from a stack near the workbench. Naya stood for a long moment in the cobblestone yard, looking up at the copper-gilded letters, and shook her head slowly. "Mrs. Stensgard," she said, "I have spent 9 years writing about people building new breweries. I have never written about a brewery that was already here." Jen drew her long charcoal gray wool coat closed at the throat. The brass-bound key on its leather thong knocked once, softly, against the bone toggle buttons of her sweater. She did not say anything. She did not have to. The brewery, behind her, in the blue dusk, looked the way it had looked for 146 years. The work, as Boris had warned her, was a fight, but it was the kind of fight Jen had been preparing for, without knowing it, for 40 years of teaching freshmen to outline an argument before they made one. On Monday morning, at the Carbon County Courthouse, Boris and Jen filed the original 1879 deed with a cover affidavit prepared by an attorney Ludi had found on Sunday night. The clerk who took the deed was a young woman with a copper braid who looked at the wax seal and said, "Ma'am, just a moment." She came back with the chief clerk. The chief clerk read the deed. The chief clerk read the cover affidavit. The chief clerk said slowly, "Mrs. Stensgard, this is going to take some time to process correctly, but it will be processed correctly. I want you to know that." By Monday afternoon, Boris had filed a stop work order on the Hazard Road demolition. By Tuesday morning, Naya's article had run online in the Brewer's Journal under the headline, "The Last Stensgard: How a Widow Walked into Her Husband's Hidden Brewery." By Wednesday afternoon, it had been picked up by the Allentown Morning Call, the Philadelphia Inquirer's regional desk, and a craft brewing podcast in Asheville. By Thursday, the Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission had announced it was fast-tracking a National Register nomination for the Stensgard Brewery and the adjacent 40 acres. Astrid's Land Development, LLC, lost its claim to the gorge frontage on the following Tuesday, when the deed cleared its initial review and the county's clerical reclassification was formally vacated. The reclassification, the chief clerk wrote in her decision, had originated in a 1984 administrative file and had been propagated forward without ever being supported by an instrument of severance. There was no severance. There never had been. There was only a young administrator's daughter who had understood, in 1972, that a confused county filing could be left alone long enough to become a habit. The demolition deposit Astrid had paid in February was refunded in full to the LLC. The wrecking crew was stood down. But the contractor, the thick-shouldered man in the Carhartt jacket Jen had seen across the coffee shop, was within 10 days the subject of a Pennsylvania Department of Labor and Industry inquiry. 2 of his former crew members spoke on the record to Naya. They said he had been told, off the record, that the building he was being paid to demolish was likely historic and that the owner had no documented authority to demolish it. He had taken the deposit anyway. He had scheduled the crew. The inquiry would eventually result in the suspension of his demolition license for 18 months. Astrid herself fared worse. Once the brewery dispute reached the regional papers, forensic accountants engaged by the State Board of Hospital Administration, apparently in connection with an unrelated matter that had been quietly accumulating for 2 years, reviewed her finances and found a pattern of irregularities in the way she had managed an endowment-adjacent fund at St. Luke's Allentown during her last 4 years as administrator. The board opened a formal inquiry. Her professional license, the local paper reported in early December, had been placed under review. Rydar Vole, Astrid's husband of 41 years, filed for separation a week before Christmas. He moved into a furnished apartment in Bethlehem. He did not, when reached by Naya, give a reason on the record. Off the record, his only statement was, "I am tired." Their daughter Britta called Jen on a cold morning in mid-December. Jen took the call at the kitchen table she had once shared with Magnus. Britta's voice was small. Britta said, "Aunt Jen, I read the article. I did not know. I want you to know that I did not know. I'm so sorry." Jen, who had taught 1,000 students how to apologize on paper and had received many fewer than that in her life, said, "Britta, thank you. Come up and see me in the spring." Astrid sold her house in Whitehall in February. She moved into a small condo in the same town. She did not call Jen and she did not write. Boris, who tracked these things quietly, told Jen one evening over tea that Astrid had stopped attending the small Lutheran church she had belonged to for 30 years and had begun attending a different one 12 miles away. Jen received this information without commentary. Ludi, who had been less patient with Astrid for 40 years, said, "Good." Jen said only, "She was a young woman in 1972. She was 22. I am not going to forget that." In early January, the Carbon County Historical Society held a small public meeting in the basement of the county library to vote on a formal letter of support for the National Register nomination. Jen attended in her long charcoal gray wool coat with the brass-bound key inside the inner pocket. Boris drove her. Ludi sat on her left. Naya took notes from the back row. The vote was unanimous. An older man in a flannel shirt stood up afterwards and said, in a careful country voice, that his father had drunk the Lehigh Gorge Lager in 1939 and had described it to him exactly once on a porch in 1971 as the only beer that had ever tasted like the river it was made from. He had assumed for 54 years that the description was a memory of a thing that no longer existed. He sat back down and removed his cap and held it on his knees. Jen, in the second row, put her hand over the key in her pocket and did not trust herself to speak. In late December, on a still cold morning when the gorge below the brewery was full of pale mist, Jen drove out to the small cemetery on the hillside above Jim Thorpe where Magnus was buried. She walked between the stones in her long charcoal gray wool coat, with her low-heeled mahogany leather loafers leaving small prints in the frost. She carried, in her gloved hand, a small dried bundle of brewing hops tied with a length of copper wire. She knelt at Magnus's stone. She laid the bundle at the base. She put her bare palm on the cold granite where his name was cut, and she stayed there a long time. The sun came up over the eastern ridge. The mist began to lift. Somewhere in the white birches behind her, a chickadee called twice. Jen stood up. She brushed the frost from her knees. She walked back to Ludi's Subaru, which was waiting at the cemetery gate with its engine running and its driver pretending not to watch. The Stensgard Heritage Brewing Company opened to the public 14 months after Jen turned the brass-bound key for the first time. The reopening was on a clear Saturday in late January, 2 winters after Magnus's death. The boards came down off the arched windows on a Thursday, and the morning light came through them onto the brick floor in long, pale rectangles for the first time in 53 years. The copper kettle, polished to a slow sunrise even brighter than the one Jen had first seen, was operational by November. The first batch of Lehigh Gorge Lager, brewed from Olaf Stensgard's 1908 federally patented recipe, with spring water from the same gorge spring that had served the brewery in 1879, was tapped at the reopening before a small crowd of family, neighbors, journalists, preservation officers, and a delegation from the Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission. The brewery had, 3 months before, been formally added to the National Register of Historic Places. Halsey Brothers Heritage Beverages, true to their letter, handled production and distribution and left the building, the deed, the recipes, and the brand in Jen's hands. The 40 acres of Lehigh Gorge frontage that ran north along the river from the brewery had been donated by Jen the previous summer to the Carbon County Land Trust as a permanent conservation easement. The trust had named it the Magnus Stensgard Preserve. A small wooden sign with carved oak leaf decoration stood at the trailhead where Jen had walked past it for 20 years without turning her head. The brewery became a stop on the Pennsylvania Brewing Heritage Trail in its first spring. Visitors came from Reading, from Philadelphia, from as far as Pittsburgh and Buffalo, to stand in the long brick nave and put their palms on the copper kettle and read the small framed letter from Magnus that hung on the south wall in a brass frame. The letter had been Jen's idea. She had typed it out fresh, kept the original under glass at the mahogany desk in the cellar, and hung the typed copy where any stranger walking through the brewery could read it and understand what kind of man had restored the kettle they were touching. In her second spring, Jen founded the Magnus Stensgard Heritage Trades Apprenticeship. It was a paid 2-year program for young people of Carbon County, training them in heritage brewing, copper kettle restoration, small batch fermentation, and the slow, careful archival work of recovering recipes from old paper. The first cohort had 5 apprentices. Among them was a young woman named Hannah Vance, 24 years old, whose grandfather Lars had worked the Stensgard Brewery as a boy of 11 in 1971. Lars had been told the year after, by a sharp-faced young woman in a borrowed business suit, that the family business was over and that there was no point in him asking after it. Lars had told the story to his granddaughter exactly once, in 2009, the year before he died. Hannah came to the apprenticeship interview with a typed paragraph of his account in her hand. Jen read it, standing up in the front hall of the brewery, and then took both of Hannah's hands in her own and said, "Welcome home." The apprenticeship, in its second year, drew applicants from beyond Carbon County. A young man from Scranton, whose family had run a closed brewery in 1923, a woman from Easton, who had restored a small copper still in her grandmother's attic, a quiet, thoughtful boy from Jim Thorpe itself, who had grown up walking past the boarded brewery on the way to the trailhead and had wondered, as Jen had once not wondered, what was inside. Jen interviewed each of them at the mahogany desk in the cellar. She asked them to read a paragraph aloud from Olaf Stensgard's 1908 recipe folio. She listened to how they handled the unfamiliar measurements. She listened to how they handled their own uncertainty. She accepted 4 of them. She wrote a careful letter to a 5th and told her to apply again in a year. The brewery, by the end of its 3rd spring, had become what Magnus had quietly intended it to become, a working classroom under a copper roof. Ludi ran the front of house on Saturdays. She wore a leather apron Magnus would have recognized and poured small tasting glasses of the Lehigh Gorge Lager for visitors with the careful generosity of a medievalist who had finally found her century. Boris consulted on regulatory compliance and licensing and trained the apprentices in the paperwork of pre-Prohibition recipe documentation. He would, in his late 70s, become the recognized expert on heritage license reactivation in 3 states. Naya wrote a quarterly column on the brewery's progress for the Brewer's Journal and would, in time, publish a book about the year that had begun with a key falling into a widow's palm. Jen, on Sunday afternoons, sat at the mahogany desk in the cellar and rewrote a paragraph of the brewery's history, one careful sentence at a time. She had begun the first Sunday after the reopening with the year 1879 and Olaf Stensgard's arrival from Bergen. She intended, she told Ludi one evening over tea, to write straight through to the present without skipping a year. She would not, she said, skip 1972. She would not skip 1984. She would not skip the 11 months between Magnus's death and the morning the brass-bound key fell into her palm. She would write all of it down in clean teacher's prose, and she would leave the manuscript in the top right drawer of the desk for whoever sat in that chair after her. The brass-bound key now hung on a slim leather cord around her neck, where her half-moon reading glasses had once hung from their beaded chain. The reading glasses now hung from a second cord beside it. Jen had decided, at 71, that she would carry both. On a Sunday in late October, almost 2 years to the day after Astrid had stood on Jen's porch, with the release of all residual claims, Jen sat at the mahogany desk in the cellar, with her notebook open in front of her, and the low, warm light of the desk lamp making the deed under its glass cover gleam dull gold. Upstairs, faintly, she could hear Ludi laughing at something a visitor had said in the front hall. She could hear the slow, regular hiss of the copper kettle on its low afternoon simmer. She could hear, beyond that, the November wind moving through the birches outside the boarded window that was no longer boarded. She wrote a sentence. She crossed it out. She wrote it again. She had been, she would tell Naya later, surprised by how little anger she felt at the mahogany desk. She had expected anger to follow her down the cellar stairs. She had expected to spend Sunday afternoons cataloging Astrid's deceptions in tidy index cards, the way she had cataloged the kettle and the workbench. Instead, what she found at the desk was a slow, quiet attention to the woman she had been at 28, in a cotton sundress on the rocks above the gorge, laughing at a young man who had carried that photograph in his wallet for 43 years without telling her. The anger, when it came in small, useful waves and went again. The attention stayed. Magnus had taught her close reading, and Magnus had then asked her, with 20 patient years of Saturdays, to read him closely. Jen, on Sunday afternoons, was reading him. She wrote on a Sunday in November a paragraph about her sister-in-law. She wrote it carefully. She wrote that Astrid had been a frightened young woman in 1972 who had decided that if she could not have a future of her own, she would at least have control of a past that did not belong to her. She wrote that this was a kind of grief and a kind of theft, and that the two could share a body for a lifetime. She wrote that she did not forgive Astrid, and did not intend to, and that this was a separate matter from the truth of the deed, and the truth of the kettle, and the truth of the 40 acres along the gorge. She wrote that Brita had come up in the spring, as Jen had asked her to, and had spent 2 days at the brewery, learning the names of the fermenting vessels from Hannah Vance. She wrote that this was not redemption for anyone, and was simply what had happened. She read the paragraph back. She left it standing. In her 3rd spring at the brewery, on a clear morning when the white birches along Hazard Road were just coming into leaf, Jen stood in the cobblestone yard with the brass-bound key on its slim leather cord at her throat and watched the first cohort of apprentices unload a wagon load of fresh oak staves from a flatbed truck. Hannah Vance was at the head of the line, calling instructions in her grandfather's careful Carbon County cadence. Boris was leaning on the doorjamb of the main hall, arms crossed, watching with the particular pride of a man who had finally finished a sentence he had begun in February of 1972. Ludi was at the door of the front of house with a thermos of black tea in one hand and a clipboard in the other, the way she had stood at the front of every English department meeting Jen had ever attended. Naya was sitting on the running board of the flatbed with her notebook open, asking Hannah questions and writing the answers in shorthand. The November mist of the year before felt, that morning, like a long time ago and like yesterday at the same time. Jen put one hand to the key at her throat. She thought, as she had thought every morning since the brewery reopened, of Magnus on a Saturday in 1996, a year she had not known he was driving to Hazard Road, laying out his hand tools on the workbench under a boarded window and beginning, alone, the slow, careful polishing of a copper rivet. She thought of him in 2003, mixing a trial batch and pouring it down the cellar drain because it was not yet right. She thought of him in 2016, finishing the 3rd fermenting vessel and writing in his careful script in the brewer's notebook, We are getting close. She thought of him 3 weeks before he died, writing Phase 4 restoration complete, recipe finalized, ready for Jen when she finds the staircase to the cellar. She thought of the way a quiet teacher restores a copper kettle for 20 patient years, only when he knows exactly who is meant to turn it on. She walked across the cobblestone yard to the front of the brewery. She stood under the copper-gilded ironwork letters that read Stensgard. She turned and looked back at the apprentices, and at her friends, and at the small, clean wooden sign at the trailhead that read, in Hannah's careful carving, the Magnus Stensgard Preserve. She put her hand on the heavy oak door with its iron strap hinges. The door, these days, was rarely locked. The brass-bound key at her throat was, she had come to understand, less a key than a witness. She had not needed it to open a door for 2 years. She wore it because Magnus had hung it on a leather thong and had written for Jen on a small handwritten tag in his careful teacher's hand, and because there were some objects a widow carried not for what they unlocked, but for what they kept open. Inside, the copper kettle was warming. A young apprentice was checking the temperature with a brass thermometer Magnus had used in 2009. The smell of cedar and hops moved through the long brick nave, the way the autumn light moved through the unboarded arched windows. And Jen, standing in the doorway in her long charcoal gray wool coat over her forest green cashmere sweater with the bone toggle buttons, understood that the brewery was not, finally, what Magnus had left her. The brewery was where Magnus had left her, a place to stand, a building to be inside of, a long, slow kettle to tend, while she finished her own work. He had given her, with 20 patient Saturdays and a single brass-bound key, the rest of her life. She walked into the hall. She took her place at the mahogany side table where her index cards lay. She opened her notebook. The Lehigh Gorge Lager, in its first spring batch, was beginning to come up to brewing temperature in the kettle 3 feet away. Hannah Vance was reading aloud from Olaf's 1908 recipe, the way Jen had once taught her own freshmen to read aloud from Whitman. Ludi laughed at something Boris said in the front of house. Naya wrote something in shorthand. The brass-bound key at Jen's throat caught the light. Outside, the November birches of the year before had turned, in their slow, careful way, into the new green leaves of a third spring, and Gen Stensgard, at 73, in a brick brewery on the edge of Jim Thorpe that bore her name in copper-gilded ironwork above the door, picked up her pen and wrote the next sentence. Thank you for descending every stone step of Genevieve's journey. From the cold November day, a sister-in-law tried to bury a brewery in 22 days, to the warm copper light of a kettle her husband had been polishing for 20 patient years. If Genevieve's story touched something deep inside you, if you've ever been told a piece of your family's history was lost decades before you were born, if you've ever stood with a single brass-bound key in your palm and wondered whether the door it fit was even meant for you, if you've discovered that the loved one you lost had been protecting you all along, leave just one word in the comments describing the exact moment you realized that the quiet ones in your life had been keeping a copper kettle warm for years. Because Genevieve's story proves that quiet teachers restore copper kettles only for the woman they have always loved, that a sister-in-law's lie cannot outlive the truth her brother kept locked in a cellar, and that a brass-bound key in the palm of a widow can outweigh a demolition deposit any day of the year. Share this story with someone who needs to remember that what looks like a boarded brewery on a forgotten mountain road can hold an inheritance no demolition crew ever read, because the brewer kept his kettle polished for the woman who loved him most. Welcome to the last chapter. We'll see you in the next story.